What is up, everybody? My name's Ark, the Tabletop Arcanist, and this is the Optimizer's Anvil, part of the Arcanist Forge network. In this series, we take in-depth looks at powerful and fun-to-play builds in Dungeons & Dragons. Today, we're going to be looking at a DPR build, which is to say we're looking at a build that focuses on doing sustained damage over multiple rounds of combat. Now, in my eyes, there are two types of DPR builds: resource-dependent DPR builds and resource-independent DPR builds. Resource-dependent builds tend to be the highest damage output builds in the game, but burn out after 1 or 2 combats. Think your standard wizard. Resource-independent builds deal significantly less damage, but are pretty much ready to fight all the time and never really feel like they're in too much of a sticky situation. Think your average fighter. This video focuses on the former of the two to put out absurd amounts of damage over several rounds before eventually tiring out. I call this build the Radiant Shroud Sorcerer. It combines Warlock, Sorcerer, and Artificer to put out roughly 300 damage per round at max level. It also boasts surprising beefiness, which is really good because you need to be up in your opponent's face most of the time. Now, with all of my videos that deal with exceptionally powerful builds, I'd like to put in this caveat. This is an S-tier build. Not only that, it really scrapes the very top of the S-tier builds that I have personally made. Due to its really high damage output, it can be difficult to contain, and your DM needs to be on board with incorporating that into their world. Remember, D&D is about telling a story, and if your DM thinks that this build is going to dismantle the story that they're trying to tell, you need to work with them to explore some options to make it fit in better. If you're a DM thinking about letting a player play this build, I have some tips and tricks at the end of this video for dealing with it. Okay, enough preamble, let's get into the build. At character creation, we actually have a lot of solid options for race, which I really love. Because we already have that high damage output, my focus for picking a race is going to be to increase our beefiness. My top 2 choices for this are Warforged because of the armor and Dwarf because of the extra health. But because I'm trying to make these videos fit into as many campaigns as possible, I'm going to assume that most people are going to use a standard point buy. If that's the case, we really want 14 dex to support our usage of medium armor, 16 con for health and concentration checks, 13 intelligence because we're going to be taking that artificer dip, and 16 charisma for our damage output. Using a standard point buy leaves us 1 point shy of this goal. So my suggestion is to take custom lineage and take the resilient feat, which will bump up our con by 1, giving us the stats that we need, and also give us proficiency in constitution saving throws, which will be great for concentration checks. Aesthetically, I like to think of us looking like a fallen Aasimar that has fallen so far from grace from their deity that they've been stripped completely of their divine powers. Perhaps because of the dark pact they made with their Hexblade patron, which they'll pick up at level 1. I think this offers a great amount of storyline potential. Perhaps our character is attempting to regain their divine birthright after they lost it, so they're on a journey of redemption. This works really well with some of the subclasses that we're going to take after our Warlock levels, and I love it when a subclass aligns with what our character is doing in the game. Equipment-wise, we're going to take the best medium armor we can get, which is probably scale mail at this point because of how expensive Halfplate is. And as far as weapons go, we are going to pick up 2 short swords because we don't start off as a pure spellslinger. At level 1, like I said, we're going to be a Warlock, and take the Hexblade subclass. This gives us access to the armor proficiency we need to support our medium armor, and our weapon proficiencies. It's also going to give us shield proficiency, access to Hexblade's Curse, access to the Hex spell, and access to Eldritch Blast. We are going to use literally all of these features for a significant portion of time throughout this build. We are going to use the Hex Warrior feature of level 1 Hexblade to allow one of our swords to use our charisma modifier instead of our dex for damage and attack rolls. This isn't a huge boost, but it is a little nice DPR boost early game. Our starting level DPR rotation is going to be this. Turn 1, we have only 1 sword drawn and we cast the Hex spell on our target. Then we stab them with that 1 drawn sword and use our object interaction to draw out our other sword. Turn 2, we place our Hexblade's Curse on our target, which will allow us to add our proficiency modifier to all of our attack's damage and allow us to crit on 19 to 20, which is really fantastic. We then use our action that round to stab again. Every round thereafter, we're just going to stab with our action, and then, because we're dual wielding, stab with our bonus action. Because our target is hexed and afflicted by our Hexblade's curse, our main hand weapon is going to do 2d6 damage plus 5, and our offhand weapon is going to do 2d6 damage plus 2. It's kind of like we're dual wielding greatswords. Against an armor 10 opponent, at level 1 we're already dealing 18 damage per round post setup. And against an armor 15 opponent, we'll be dealing 13 damage per round. At level 1, that's like a lot of damage. We're going to be cutting through bosses like butter. At level 2, we take Warlock 2, which gives us access to invocations. We're going to take Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast. We're still very much in melee mode, so we're not going to use these right away, but we are going to get a ton of value out of them later on down the line. At level 3, our character is going to start our redemption arc and abandon the path of the Warlock in favor of the bulk of their levels, which is going to be Sorcerer. For our Sorcerer's origin, we really only have one choice because we absolutely require the spell Spirit Shroud, which is not a Sorcerer spell. Because of this, we have to take Divine Soul because it gives us access to the Cleric's spell list, which does in fact have Spirit Shroud on it. We also get Favored by the Gods, which is a solid boost in case some of our damage decides to go wide. Spell-wise, we're going to pick up Shield and Magic Missiles because they're both just really good spells. Shield is going to be a big boost to our defense, and Magic Missiles is going to boost our DPR in situations where we can't really get into melee too well. At level 4, we go Sorcerer 2 and we get Font of Magic, which is actually a really useful ability for us because we're going to be very reliant on sorcery points in order to increase our DPR. We can also grab Healing Word, which is just an endlessly clutch spell if one of our allies goes down. At level 5, we take Sorcerer 3, and thankfully we can drop our weapons because our Eldritch Blast now hits twice. We'll want to switch to having a shield in one hand and leave our other hand free to cast spells. I'm also assuming that at some point in our adventure, we will have scrounged up some half plate, so our armor is going to be boosted all the way up to 19 at this level, which is really fantastic. Remember, we also have the shield spell, so our armor is effectively 24 while we have spell slots available. This is going to keep our concentration a lot safer from heavy hitting monsters like a hill giant or something else we might see at this level. We also gain access to meta magic, and there's really only one that we care about, and it's Quicken Spell. Any other meta magics that you happen across throughout this build, you can just pick whatever seems cool and flavorful to you at the time. Despite Quicken Spell being so important to our build, we only have 3 sorcery points, so we can't utilize it that great at this point in the build, but it is going to be a solid DPR boost just to be able to double cast every once in a while. At level 6, Sorcerer 4, we're going to fix that problem and start looking more like the badass DPR that we knew we'd grow up to be. We get an ASI, and we're going to trade it out for the Meta Magic Adept feat. This is going to give us 2 sorcery points and access to more meta magic. Like I said, we only care about Quicken Spell, so take whatever you want. We were really only after those sweet, sweet Sorc points. Of which you now have 6, so we can start adding Quicken Spell into our regular DPR rotation. Our MO in combat has become this. First round, we're going to Hex, and then Eldritch Blast, which now hits twice. Second round, we slap that Hexblade's Curse on our opponent and Eldritch Blast again. For the next 3 rounds, we Eldritch Blast, then Quicken Spell, and Eldritch Blast again as our bonus action. After the fight, which is likely over by this point, we're going to use Font of Magic to regain some of those sorcery points. Against an Armor 10 opponent, once we already have our hexes up, we're going to be blasting in for 55 points of damage. Against an Armor 15, we're still going to be putting out 40 points of damage. And against an Armor 19, if our DM is feeling spicy, we're still going to be putting out 28 damage per round. If your combat lasts more than 5 rounds, which isn't super common if you have a full party, don't forget that you can use Font of Magic as a bonus action to restore some of your sorcery points in combat. This will allow you to alternate rounds of single Eldritch Blasting and restoring points, and double Eldritch Blasting with those points you just restored. Also, don't forget that we have Repelling Blast, and we're now hitting 4 times a round with our Eldritch Blast, meaning that we can push an opponent up to 40 feet in a single round. Fights on boats, or on cliff sides, or near moats have just become your best friend because you can be hurling people over ledges left and right, which is just an absolute blast. Going into level 7, we're a Sorcerer 5, and we gain access to one of my favorite spells in the game, and the namesake of this build, Spirit Shroud. This will allow us to add a D8 to our Eldritch Blasts rather than Hex's D6. but it requires us to be within 10 feet of our opponent, which is why we focus so much on getting our armor up. It's also upcastable, which is going to be what really causes this build to run away damage-wise. Another nice thing about Spirit Shroud is that it's a buff to us rather than a debuff on an enemy, which means that if we have the luxury of knowing combat's about to happen, we can cast it before combat begins. It's always nice to cut out any sort of prep rounds in combat so you can get into doing your big damage quicker. It also should be noted that you have enough spell slots to now be adding Scorching Ray to your DPR rotation, but this low level, I really like to conserve some of those spell slots, so I'm not going to add it in until later on when we start to have some really useless lame duck spell slots at higher levels. Now, because we're going to be in our opponent's faces more often, we're also going to be getting hit more often, which means more concentration checks. To ensure we don't lose our concentration on our important high-level spells, we're going to take a dip out of Sorcerer at the moment and dip into Artificer. Storyline-wise, I like to think that our fallen Aasimar has become so desperate to restore their divine powers that they've turned to the mortal science of alchemy in order to give them back some of what they've lost. So at level 8, we're an Artificer 1, and we don't really gain a whole lot at this level. At level 9, however, we are an Artificer 2, and we get one of the things that we came for with this dip in the form of infusions. We're going to take my favorite infusion, the much slept on Mind Sharpener. This allows us to turn a failed concentration check into a passed concentration check at the cost of our reaction. It has 4 charges, and it regains 1d4 charges at dawn. This is a fantastic tool, particularly later on when we're going to be investing really high level spell slots into our Spirit Shroud. Don't forget about the fact that it uses your reaction, meaning you can't use it on the same turn that you use Shield. This is okay, however, because most of the time that you're going to be wanting to use the Sharpener, a Shield wouldn't have helped you anyway. For our second infusion, you kind of have a choice between enhancing your focus and enhancing your armor. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to focus on enhancing my armor, so I have to take less concentration checks in the long run. But you can swap them out pretty frequently, so I would go ahead and learn both just in case. For our DPR calculations going forward, I'm going to assume that you're set on defense, which will put us up to 20 AC, 25 with shield, which is pretty respectable. At level 10, we take our final Artificer level and become an Artificer 3. The cool thing about multi-classing as an Artificer is that they actually round up their half-caster levels for determining your multi-level spell slots, rather than rounding down like a Ranger or a Paladin would. This means that at level 3, we count as adding 2 levels of Spellcaster to our build, which is really nice and will be very relevant when we get that 9th level spell slot down the road. And we get our subclass at level 3, which we're going to take the Alchemist. Alchemist is one of the reasons why Artificer is one of my favorite 3 dips in the game, particularly because of its class feature, Experimental Elixir. This allows us to create a random elixir every time we take a long rest, and allows us to trade spell slots for specific elixirs. The 2 that we're most interested in are Resilience, which allows us to add 1 to our AC, and Boldness, which allows us to add 1d4 to our attack rolls and saving throws for a minute. It's essentially concentrationless Bless, but even better than that because it's not Bless, so it stacks with Bless if you have a cleric in your party. This is going to be a major boon for us against higher AC enemies later on down the line, and it's always nice to boost our AC and saving throws up a little bit. Additionally, because drinking an elixir is an action, it gives us a nice little double buff round if we need it at the beginning of a combat, where you can quaff an elixir as your action and then Hex or cast Spirit Shroud as your bonus action. Okay, now we're going to jump back into Sorcerer and ride it all the way to level 20. At level 11, we're a Sorcerer 6. This boosts us up to having 4 rounds of our Quicken spell. It also grants us Empowered Healing, which eats up sorcery points in exchange for re-rolling healing dice, but our sorcery points are already spoken for, so we're probably only going to use this in an absolute emergency. The most important thing that we get at this level is a boost to our Eldritch Blast, which now hits 3 times instead of 2. We also have 2 4th level spell slots just sitting there doing really nothing, so we can start adding a upcast Scorching Ray into our DPR rotation. After any needed setup rounds, we're going to start laying into our opponent using Eldritch Blast and then using Quicken Spell to cast Scorching Ray at 4th level. This produces 8 attacks, all of which proc Spirit Shroud. Against an armor 19 opponent, we're going to Sear in for 83 damage. Against an armor 15, we're going to be pumping out 103 DPR. And against an armor 10, we hit for 131 damage on these rounds. After these 2 rounds, we'll run out of 4th level spell slots and switch back to just double Eldritch Blasting. For these 2 rounds, we'll deal 65 damage, 85 damage, and 103 damage to armors 19, 15, and 10 respectively. To put that in perspective, if we're fighting an adult blue Dracolich, which is a pretty solid boss monster for a group of level 11s, we're going to be putting out 296 damage over the course of those 4 rounds. The average adult blue Dracolich only has 295 HP. So alone, at level 11, you're going to put a CR 17 boss monster in the dirt in 4 rounds. That is insane. But even though those are some pretty big hits, they're about to get even bigger. At level 12, we're going Sorcerer 7. This affords us a 5th level spell slot, which allows us to upcast Spirit Shroud for the first time. Upcasting Spirit Shroud, rightly so, is a little bit more expensive than other spells. It only goes up in damage every 2 levels it's upcast past its original level of 3. This means that every time we go up an odd level spell slot, we're going to get a major damage boost. So, at 5th level, it's dealing 2d8 damage rather than 1. However, I'm going to hold off on the damage calculation for 1 more level, because at level 13, Sorcerer 8, we get an ASI, which is going to pump our Charisma up to 18, and our proficiency bonus also goes up by 1. At this level, we're going to use the same rotation as we were before because we want to conserve our 5th level spell slots in case we need to recast Spirit Shroud. But that rotation just got supercharged with our bump to Spirit Shroud. Against an armor 19, we now hit for 131 damage in our 4th level Scorching Ray rounds. Whoa, that's a lot of damage! Against an armor 15, we hit for 166, and against an armor 10, we hit for 179. Once we've burned through all of our spell slots, we're still going to be punching through for 109 damage against armor 19 opponents with just double Eldritch Blast. That Dracolich isn't even lasting 2 rounds against this absolute onslaught of damage. At level 14, Sorcerer 9, we're not going to get a whole lot, but we do get a slight boost to damage by getting a 6th level spell slot, which we're just going to add into our upcast Scorching Ray rotation. At level 15, Sorcerer 10, we get more meta magic, but again, we don't really care about that, we just want Quicken Spell, so just take whatever seems neat. At level 16, Sorcerer 11, we become a 13th level caster, which affords us a 7th level spell slot. This, once again, mega charges our Spirit Shroud from doing 2d8 damage to 3d8. At level 17, we go Sorcerer 12, which gives us our final ASI, which puts our Charisma to 20. It also gives us our final boost to Eldritch Blast, which now hits 4 times rather than 3. And we get a bonus to our proficiency modifier. It is at this point that this build really starts to get out of hand damage-wise. In our first post-setup round, we're going to burn a 6th level Scorching Ray to deal 259 damage to an armor 19 opponent, 308 damage to an armor 15 opponent, and at this point I don't think we're really going to be facing armor 10 opponents, so who cares. In our second round, we're going to burn a 5th level Scorching Ray. This will yield 236 damage to an armor 19 and 281 to an armor 15. And then for the rest of our rounds, we're just going to double Eldritch Blast because Eldritch Blast and Scorching Ray are pretty close to each other at this level, so we may as well conserve the spell slots. During these rounds, we hit for 201 to an armor 19 and 240 to an armor 15. Again, let's put that in perspective. I'm going to match us up against a monster that is not good for us to deal with in the form of the Aspect of Tiamat. This is a challenge rating 30 monster that is a literal god. It's also immune to fire, so we're stuck with just double Eldritch Blasting it. Now, I'm not going to get too far into the mechanics of the actual boss because I don't want to spoil it for anyone whose DM might be thinking about using this monster as a BBEG or something like that. But let's just say it has more AC than 19. On average, we're still going to be pumping out 148 damage per round against this monster. Now, obviously the Dragon Goddess isn't going to make it easy on us, but with some support from healers and support from some damage mitigators, we're going to be walking out of a fight that should be nearly impossible, feeling pretty good about our DPR. I mean, putting down an aspect of Tiamat in roughly 4 rounds is pretty out of this world. And it doesn't stop there, we get a huge boost in damage again at level 20. That being said, going to level 20, we do have an interesting choice, both storyline-wise and build-wise. All we really need out of 18, 19, and 20 is 3 more levels of Full Caster to get our 9th level spell slot, which presents you with 2 unique paths, both of which tell a different story for our character. One is that you actually take the next 3 levels in Bard. This gives you a Bardic subclass, which I recommend taking the College of Eloquence to boost your non-attack spells. Storyline-wise, if our character is more on the evil side of things, perhaps we've completely forsaken our journey towards divine ascension and irrevocably severed ties with the divine entity that is our ancestor. If your character is more good to neutral, perhaps their arc is that they've just accepted themselves in their non-ascended state. They take up the pursuit of artistry or writing, a la Bilbo Baggins returning to the Shire and working on There and Back again. Your other option is to stay in Sorcerer all the way to level 20. This affords you the ability to learn an 8th level Cleric or Sorcerer spell, of which there are many awesome options. You also get your level 14 Sorceress Origin feature, which to me completes your Divine Ascension and Redemption arcs. Because I'm a big fan of having access to high level spells, and because I feel like this arc is the most complete and the most deserved for our character, I'm going to follow this route. So at level 18, we're a Sorcerer 13 and gain very little. At level 19, we go Sorcerer 14 and gain our Sorceress Origin feature, Otherworldly Wings. Hopefully something momentous just happened regarding the arc of our character, because Otherworldly Wings are going to burst from our back, giving us an essentially permanent flight speed. Your character is now visually and spiritually restored to their angelic self, thus completing your character arc. While this isn't a huge boon in combat, it is super flavorful, and obviously being able to fly is always a really nice quality of life thing, especially when it doesn't require a spell slot or concentration. And finally, at level 20, we are a Sorcerer 15. This makes us a 17th level spellcaster, which affords us a level 9 spell slot, and you know what we're gonna do with it. We are obviously not high enough level to learn a 9th level spell, but who needs Meteor Swarm when you can turn yourself into a walking meteor by casting level 9 Spirit Shroud? Okay, assume we're fighting the final boss of the campaign, and we don't care about being conservative with any spell slots at this point, so we're just going all out. In our first post-setup round of combat, we're going to burn an 8th level spell slot to shoot out 9 Scorching Rays. Against an armor 19 opponent, we deal, are you sitting down? 355 damage.
Whoa! That's a lot of damage.
Remember, we're not a Nova build, we're a DPR build. We just did over 300 damage, and it's just part of our rotation. Next, we burn a 6th level Scorching Ray for a round where we deal 302 damage, and then we burn a 5th level Scorching Ray to deal 276 damage. For the next few rounds, we're going to burn 4th level Scorching Rays. These will deal 249 damage to an armor 19 opponent. At the end of our 4th round, we will have broken 1,000 damage. Woo! And we've still got 4th level spell slots to burn. And if something has lived through that somehow and you eventually need to start double Eldritch Blasting, you're still gonna do 233 damage a round. This means that even the fire immune Tiamat is only gonna last like 3 rounds against you before it drops to 0. Additionally, there's 2 incredible aspects of this build that I've really only mentioned in passing so far. The first is that we've had 16 con this entire time, meaning that if we've taken average health, we have 149 HP at level 20. And roughly 20 to 26 armor, depending on what elixirs we're using and if we have shield up. So while we aren't a Bear Totem Barbarian, we really can take a hit before we go down. The second is that, remember, we do have Repelling Blast, and we're now hitting monsters 8 times in a single round with Eldritch Blast. So in combats where you don't necessarily want to burn your Hexblade's Curse or your Spirit Shroud, you can just revert back to being a control caster by essentially pushing back anyone you want 80 feet per round. If you get pushed back 80 feet in a round, you're effectively out of combat for that turn. It's almost as good as a stun against a melee opponent. It's also one of my favorite aspects of this build. Nothing's more fun than killing a monster by shoving it off a ledge remotely. It's just the most stylish way to take down an enemy. I absolutely love this character. It's everything you want in an S tier build because it's really powerful and also lends itself to storytelling. Every optimized option you take is more flavorful than the last, and even a person who isn't really that comfortable role-playing won't be able to help but having their character grow and change as they mechanically grow and change with this build. And to me, that makes this build just perfect. However, obviously this build is absolutely out of hand numbers-wise, which can be very difficult for a DM to deal with. So here are my tips for incorporating this build into your campaign. The first thing is to think about how reliant this character is on being 10 feet away from an opponent. They can't be 5 feet away from an opponent, and they can't be 15. They need to be 10. You can and should be having your monsters step past this character's comfort zone. This will force the character to either take disadvantage on their attacks, or it will force them to step back, taking an attack of opportunity. Additionally, if this character gets too close to a boss monster like an aspect of Tiamat and then does an absurd amount of damage, the monster should react accordingly. Even a non-sentient monster is going to understand just how badly this player character hurt it, and they're going to want to end that threat against them. Just like in a video game when a DPS does too much damage and pulls aggro, this should occur in your games when this character goes off. Even with the beefiness of this build, it's not going to love suffering several full attacks from an appropriately scaled monster. And finally, Counterspell and Dispel Magic exist for a reason. Even if your sorcerer is smart and took Counterspell themselves, counterspelling a Dispel Magic is going to burn the reaction, leaving them open to getting hit for a lot of damage and not being able to use Shield or their Mind Sharpener. This can result in them losing their concentration on that awesome 9th level spell or 7th level spell depending on what level they're at. However, if you still find that this build is toppling the balance of your game, talk to your player about reining in some of its numbers. I would focus on Spirit Shroud as the culprit of this build's insane damage. Work with your player to find numbers that fit your campaign. A good place to start is probably making Spirit Shroud upcast every 3 levels rather than every 2. This will pump the brakes just a little bit on the rapid progression of damage that this build exhibits. If that doesn't go far enough, you can even just cap Spirit Shroud at dealing 2d8 damage. This isn't the worst thing in the world because it then allows your player to use more higher level spell slots for more fun things. Additionally, it blunts the end of this build without removing its essence. They're still going to want to use Spirit Shroud because it's a lot better than Hex, which means they're still going to be up in opponents' faces dealing large amounts of damage. Well, that's all the advice I have. I hope you have fun playing this flavorful monstrosity. If you decide to play this build for yourself, I would absolutely love to hear your experiences with it in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to support a truly independent creator, please check out my Patreon campaign. Thank you all for watching, and keep forging on.